Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something medieval, intellectual, and absolutely back-breaking. We're exploring how medieval monks survived copying Aquinas all day. You might think being surrounded by profound philosophy in a peaceful monastery sounds appealing. You wake up in a Benedictine monastery in northern France, 1270. The bells ring for Lauds at 4 a.m. Snow covers the cloister. Your assignment today, copy 12 pages of the Summa Theologica. By hand, in Latin, without making a single error. The ink keeps freezing, your fingers are numb, and you're supposed to contemplate the divine mysteries while your back slowly turns into a question mark. This is your life for the next 40 years. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, the screen will soon go dark too, and let's begin this evening's journey together. It's 4 a.m. in the monastery of St. Denis, northern France. The year is 1270, and Thomas Aquinas has just finished his masterwork, the Summa Theologica. 3,000 pages of the most complex philosophical theology ever written, by hand, word for word, without a single mistake. The bell for Lauds cuts through your dreamless sleep like a blade through parchment. You've been asleep for exactly 4 hours. Your straw mattress offers about as much comfort as a bag of turnips, and the winter air in the dormitory is so cold your breath forms clouds in the darkness. 20 other monks stir around you, their movements accompanied by the symphony of medieval morning sounds, coughing, groaning, and the rustle of rough wool habits against equally rough skin. You roll off your narrow cot, your joints protesting with the enthusiasm of a 40-year-old body that's been sleeping on what amounts to organized hay for the past 15 years. The stone floor beneath your bare feet is approximately the temperature of the 9th circle of hell, if hell happened to be frozen solid. You fumble for your sandals in the darkness, knowing that if you're late to Lauds, Brother Superior will assign you extra copying duties, as if 12 hours a day wasn't sufficient penance. The chapel bells continue their relentless bronze assault on the pre-dawn silence. You shuffle toward the chapel with your brothers, a procession of shivering figures in brown robes, looking less like the soldiers of Christ and more like refugees from a very cold war. The chapel itself offers no relief from the temperature. Stone walls, stone floors, stone everything. The medieval church believed that comfort was the enemy of the soul. Your chattering teeth suggest they may have been onto something. Lauds lasts exactly 1 hour. 1 hour of chanting in Latin while your stomach growls with the subtle persistence of a monastery cat. 1 hour of standing on stone floors while feeling slowly drains from your feet. 1 hour of praising the Lord for another blessed day, while secretly calculating how many more decades of this you can survive before your spine gives up entirely. When the service ends, you have exactly 30 minutes before terce, the next service. Barely enough time to visit the latrine, splash freezing water on your face, and contemplate the theological implications of spending your entire existence in a state of controlled hypothermia. The monastery latrine, by the way, is a marvel of medieval engineering, a long wooden bench with holes cut in it, positioned over a flowing stream. Privacy is a concept that hasn't been invented yet. Neither has toilet paper. You make do with straw, moss, or whatever else seems less likely to cause infection. The refectory opens for a brief breakfast, a hunk of bread that could double as a construction material, watered down ale that tastes like disappointment, and possibly some cheese if the monastery's finances are particularly robust this month. You eat in silence because talking during meals is forbidden. You eat quickly because terce begins promptly, and tardiness is considered a sin against punctuality, which is apparently one of the more serious spiritual failings. After terce comes the moment you've been both anticipating and dreading, your assignment to the scriptorium. Brother Superior approaches you with the expression of a man delivering either very good news or a death sentence. In your case, it might be both. Brother Anselm, he says, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority mixed with what might be sympathy. You have been chosen for a sacred task. Master Thomas of Aquino has completed his great work, the Summa Theologica. We have been blessed to receive a copy for our library. Your responsibility is to create a second copy, perfect in every detail, for our brothers at the Monastery of Cluny. You nod with the appropriate mixture of humility and enthusiasm, while internally your soul begins composing its resignation letter. The Summa Theologica. You've heard whispers about this work. 3,000 pages. Questions about everything from the nature of God to whether angels can occupy the same space simultaneously. Latin so technical it makes Cicero look like children's poetry. Arguments so complex they require arguments about the arguments. Brother Superior continues, you will work under Brother Marcus in the scriptorium. The work must be completed within 18 months. Each page must be perfect. Each word must be exact. Each letter must be formed with precision. Remember, you are not merely copying words. You are preserving the wisdom of the Church for generations of scholars yet unborn. 18 months, 3,000 pages. That's roughly 5.5 pages per day, 7 days a week, with no allowance for illness, hand cramps, or the occasional complete mental breakdown. You perform the mental mathematics with the efficiency of a trained accountant and arrive at the conclusion that you have essentially been sentenced to a very intellectual form of slow torture. The scriptorium is located on the second floor of the monastery's library building, positioned to catch the maximum amount of natural light available during the brief winter days, which in northern France in December amounts to roughly 4 hours of decent illumination and 8 hours of squinting at parchment by candlelight, while your eyes gradually surrender their will to live. Brother Marcus, the master scribe, is a thin man whose posture suggests he has spent the better part of his 60 years hunched over manuscripts like a scholarly question mark. His fingers are permanently stained with ink. His eyes have the slightly unfocused look of someone who has spent decades deciphering medieval handwriting, and his back curves in a way that suggests his spine has made peace with gravity years ago. "Welcome to your new calling, Brother Anselm," he says, gesturing toward a wooden desk positioned near the largest window. The desk is equipped with the tools of your trade, a selection of quill pens made from goose feathers, an inkwell containing black ink mixed from oak galls and iron, a knife for sharpening the quills and scraping away mistakes, and a pumice stone for smoothing the parchment surface. The parchment itself is made from sheepskin, carefully prepared through a process involving lime, stretching and scraping that transforms animal hide into a writing surface smooth enough to accept ink without bleeding. Each sheet costs approximately what a peasant family earns in a month. This means that every mistake you make is not just a waste of time, it's a financial catastrophe. Brother Marcus places the original manuscript of the Summa Theologica on a reading stand next to your desk. The book is enormous, bound in leather and locked with brass clasps. When he opens it, you get your first glimpse of what the next 18 months hold in store. The pages are covered with text written in a precise Gothic script, dense with abbreviations and technical terminology. The margins are filled with additional notes and corrections. Some pages contain diagrams illustrating logical arguments. Others feature decorative capitals that would take a skilled illuminator days to reproduce. Each page must be exact, Brother Marcus explains, pointing to a particularly complex passage about the relationship between divine essence and existence. Every abbreviation must be reproduced precisely. Every correction must be noted. Every marginal comment must be included in its proper position. We are not interpreting or improving upon Master Thomas's work. We are preserving it exactly as he wrote it. You nod with the enthusiasm of a man who has just been shown his own grave. The first page of the Summa begins with a question about whether sacred doctrine is a science. The Latin reads, Utrum sacra doctrina sit scientia. A simple enough sentence, until you realize it's followed by 4 columns of dense argumentation involving references to Aristotle. Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, and approximately 17 other authorities whose names you can barely pronounce, let alone understand. Brother Marcus demonstrates the proper technique for cutting a quill pen. The feather must be selected from the left wing of a goose, trimmed to the correct length, and shaped with a knife to create a point fine enough for precise lettering but sturdy enough to last for several hours of continuous writing. The process requires the patience of a saint and the precision of a surgeon. Too broad a cut, and your letters will be thick and clumsy. Too narrow, and the pen will tear the parchment or fail to hold sufficient ink. The ink itself is a marvel of medieval chemistry. Oak galls, those round growths found on oak trees, are crushed and mixed with iron sulfate to create a solution that turns deep black when exposed to air. The mixture must be prepared fresh every few days, strained to remove particles that might clog the pen, and kept at exactly the right consistency. Too thick, and it won't flow properly. Too thin, and it will bleed through the parchment or fade over time. You spend the morning learning to prepare your materials and practicing your lettering on pieces of scrap parchment. Brother Marcus watches with the critical eye of a master craftsman, correcting your hand position, adjusting the angle of your pen, and offering suggestions about letter spacing with the patience of someone who has trained dozens of novice scribes over the decades. The secret, he tells you, is to develop a rhythm. Each letter must be formed with the same pressure, the same speed, the same attention to detail. After several months, your hand will learn the movements automatically. Until then, every letter requires conscious effort. You practice forming the letter of 50 times, then B 50 times, then C. The Gothic script used for formal manuscripts requires each letter to be precisely shaped, with thick downstrokes and thin upstrokes, consistent spacing, and careful attention to the overall appearance of each line. A single poorly formed letter can disrupt the visual harmony of an entire page. By midday, your hand is cramping, your back aches from hunching over the desk, and you've managed to produce exactly 3 lines of acceptable text. At this rate, you calculate the Summa Theologica will be completed sometime around the year 1290, assuming you don't die of old age first. The bell rings for sext, the midday service. You file into the chapel with your fellow monks, your mind still focused on the intricacies of medieval penmanship. The prayers seem to take longer than usual, possibly because you're anxious to return to your copying, or possibly because standing for an hour after spending the morning hunched over a desk has introduced new and creative forms of physical discomfort. After sex comes dinner, more bread, a bowl of pottage made from whatever vegetables the monastery garden managed to produce before the first frost, and a cup of ale that tastes like it was brewed by someone who had heard a description of beer but never actually tasted it. You eat mechanically, your mind already planning the afternoon's work. 3 lines completed. 2,997 pages to go. The afternoon shift in the scriptorium runs from after dinner until vespers. 4 hours of copying, during which the winter daylight gradually fades and you find yourself working increasingly by candlelight. The candles are made from tallow, which means they smell like burning fat, and provide illumination roughly equivalent to a modern birthday candle. You position the candle carefully to avoid casting shadows on your work, but close enough to actually see what you're doing. Your first real attempt at copying begins with the prologue to the Summa. Because the doctor of Catholic truth ought not only to teach the proficient but also to instruct beginners, the Latin flows across the page in your careful script. Quia Catholicae veritatis doctor non solum provectos debit instruere, sed eim pertinet etiam incipienses erudere. Each word requires careful attention. Medieval Latin is filled with abbreviations that save space but require extensive memorization. Quod becomes a symbol that looks like a backwards P, S is shortened to a squiggle that bears no resemblance to the actual letters. Christus becomes Ixps with a line over the top. You must reproduce these abbreviations exactly, understanding their meaning well enough to avoid confusion, but never expanding them into full words. The text itself is challenging enough without the technical difficulties of reproduction. Aquinas writes with the precision of a mathematician and the subtlety of a poet, constructing arguments that require constant attention to logical structure. He cites Aristotle as casually as you might mention the weather, refers to Augustine as though he were sitting in the next chair, and builds philosophical arguments that stretch across multiple pages with the architectural complexity of a Gothic cathedral. As you work, you begin to understand why this particular assignment was considered both an honor and a trial. Copying the Summa requires not just technical skill but intellectual stamina. You cannot simply transcribe letters without understanding their meaning. The logical flow of the arguments must be preserved exactly, which means you must follow Aquinas' reasoning closely enough to recognize when you've made an error that disrupts the sense of a passage. The question format that Aquinas uses throughout the Summa follows a rigid structure. First, he poses a question, then he presents arguments that seem to support one answer, then he gives arguments for the opposite position, then he provides his own answer. Finally, he addresses each of the initial arguments to show why they were incorrect or incomplete. This structure, known as the Scholastic method, requires careful attention to logical transitions and argument markers. Missa sed contra confuse a respondio dicendum with an ad primum, and the entire logical structure collapses. Your hand begins to develop what will become a permanent cramp around the third hour of copying. The muscles between your thumb and forefinger burn with the constant pressure of gripping the quill. Your wrist aches from maintaining the precise angle required for proper letter formation. Your shoulder throbs from the tension of keeping your arm positioned correctly over the parchment. But the physical discomfort is nothing compared to the mental strain. Aquinas discusses concepts that push the boundaries of human understanding, the relationship between time and eternity, the nature of angelic intelligence, the mechanics of divine providence. You find yourself copying sentences about topics you've never heard of, using vocabulary that exists nowhere else in human language, preserving arguments that you understand only well enough to recognize that you don't understand them at all. The afternoon session ends when the bell rings for Vespers. You've completed exactly 7 lines of text. 7 lines out of the thousands upon thousands that stretch ahead of you like an intellectual desert. Your hand is cramped. Your eyes are watering from the strain of reading by candlelight, and your back has developed a permanent kink from hunching over the manuscript. In the chapel for Vespers, you find it difficult to concentrate on the prayers. Your mind keeps returning to the challenges of the afternoon, a particularly difficult abbreviation you're not sure you copied correctly, a marginal note whose position you may have mismarked, a word that looked different in the original than what you wrote down. You make mental notes to check these details first thing tomorrow morning, assuming your eyes haven't given up entirely by then. After Vespers comes supper. The same bread, the same pottage, the same ale that tastes like liquid regret. You eat in silence, surrounded by your brothers, each lost in his own thoughts. Some of them work in the fields, others in the kitchen, others in the workshop. Their bodies are tired from physical labor. Your body is tired from sitting still for 8 hours, while your brain slowly dissolves from intellectual overexertion. The evening recreation period lasts exactly 1 hour. Some monks spend this time reading religious texts. Others work on small craft projects or tend to administrative duties. You spend it soaking your cramped hand in warm water and trying to massage feeling back into your fingers. Tomorrow will bring another full day of copying, and your hand needs to be functional enough to hold a quill steady for 8 hours. Compline, the final service of the day, begins at 8 p.m. By then your eyes are so tired that the chapel candles appear to be surrounded by halos, and you find yourself swaying slightly during the prayers. The service ends with the great silence, which will last until Lauds the following morning. No talking, no unnecessary noise, no communication except in cases of absolute emergency. You return to the dormitory as quietly as possible, trying not to disturb your sleeping brothers. The straw mattress feels only marginally more comfortable than it did 20 hours ago. You lie on your back, staring at the darkness, your mind still processing the day's work. Tomorrow you will return to the scriptorium, take up your quill, and continue copying Aquinas' meditation on divine truth while your mortal body slowly rebels against the demands of preserving eternal wisdom. As you drift towards sleep, you perform a final calculation, 7 lines completed, 18 months to go, approximately 75,000 lines remaining. At your current rate of progress, you will finish the Summa Theologica sometime in the year 1312, assuming you live that long and your eyesight holds out. Outside, snow continues to fall against the dormitory windows. Inside, 20 monks snore, cough, and shift restlessly on their straw mattresses. And in the scriptorium above, the original manuscript of the Summa Theologica sits waiting on its reading stand, 3,000 pages of the most complex philosophy ever written, patient as eternity itself. This is your life now. This is how medieval monks survived copying Aquinas all day after day, line after line, word by word, until either the work was finished or you were. Your second day in the scriptorium begins with Brother Marcus placing before you the most intellectually intimidating document ever written, the Summa Theologica. 3,000 pages of pure philosophical theology that attempts to reconcile Aristotelian logic with Christian faith, explain the nature of God through reason, and answer literally every question about existence, morality, and salvation that the human mind can conceive. Today you begin question 1. Brother Marcus announces with the casual air of someone assuming homework rather than intellectual torture, whether sacred doctrine is a science. Master Thomas uses this question to establish whether theology can be considered a legitimate form of knowledge according to Aristotelian standards. You stare at the opening page. The Latin text swims before your eyes like an academic nightmare manifest. Utrum sacra doctrina sit scientia, whether sacred doctrine is a science. 6 simple words that launch into an exploration of epistemology so complex it would give modern philosophy professors headaches. The problem becomes immediately apparent. You're not just copying words, you're copying ideas. Ideas that took Aquinas decades to develop. Ideas that synthesize centuries of philosophical tradition. Ideas that assume you're familiar with Aristotle's complete works, Augustine's theological innovations, and the entire intellectual heritage of both Greek philosophy and Christian doctrine. You know enough Latin to copy accurately, but understanding what you're copying. That's a different challenge entirely. Aquinas begins with 5 objections to the idea that sacred doctrine could be considered a science. The first objection seems reasonable enough. Science proceeds from principles that are self-evident, but the articles of faith, which are the principles of sacred doctrine, are not self-evident. You copy this carefully, while your brain struggles to grasp what's actually being argued. Is Aquinas saying that religious belief can't be scientific? Or is he setting up a more complex argument about different types of knowledge? The answer lies buried in philosophical distinctions that Aristotle established centuries earlier. Aquinas assumes you understand the difference between demonstrative knowledge and opinion, between universal truths and particular observations, between principles known through themselves and principles accepted on authority. You copy these technical terms with growing awareness that you're preserving a conversation between intellectual giants while having the philosophical sophistication of a particularly literate turnip. The second objection introduces the concept that science deals with universal and necessary truths, while sacred doctrine seems to concern itself with particular historical events, the life of Christ, specific miracles, individual saints. How can something that treats particular cases qualify as universal knowledge? You copy the Latin scientias de universalibus et necessarius while wondering if you've ever had an original thought about the relationship between universal principles and particular applications. As you work through the third objection, the intellectual vertigo intensifies. Aquinas discusses whether sacred doctrine is speculative or practical science, citing Aristotle's distinction between knowledge pursued for its own sake and knowledge aimed at action. The argument assumes familiarity with the entire structure of Aristotelian epistemology, the categories, the physics, the metaphysics, the Nicomachean ethics. You're copying references to works you've never read about concepts you've never considered, preserving intellectual achievements that represent centuries of philosophical development. The fourth objection deals with the dignity of different sciences, arguing that natural philosophy already treats of God as the first cause, so what need is there for a separate sacred doctrine? This opens into questions about the relationship between reason and revelation, between what humans can discover about God through natural investigation versus what must be accepted through divine disclosure. You copy Aquinas' careful distinctions between God as known through creatures and God as known through revelation, while your understanding hovers somewhere between confusion and complete bewilderment. The fifth objection questions whether sacred doctrine is really superior to other sciences, given that it seems to depend on faith rather than demonstration. You copy the argument mechanically, your hand moving across the parchment while your mind tries to follow the logical structure. Aquinas is setting up a hierarchy of knowledge that places divine science above human science, but the argument requires understanding concepts like participated knowledge, analogical predication, and the relationship between finite and infinite intellects. Then comes the said contrasection, where Aquinas begins his response. But on the contrary, it is written in Deuteronomy, "This is your wisdom and understanding in the sight of the nations." You copy the biblical citation, but then Aquinas does something remarkable. He uses this single verse to launch into an analysis of how divine revelation can constitute genuine knowledge that surpasses ordinary human reasoning while still maintaining logical coherence. The Respondeo Decendum section contains Aquinas' actual answer, and this is where your intellectual inadequacy becomes most apparent. I answer that sacred doctrine is a science, he writes, but then spends pages explaining exactly what he means by science in this context. He distinguishes between sciences that derive their principles from natural reason and sciences that derive their principles from higher sciences. Sacred doctrine belongs to the second category, receiving its principles from divine knowledge itself. The analogy he uses is both brilliant and completely over your head, just as music accepts principles from mathematics without proving them independently. Sacred doctrine accepts principles from divine revelation without requiring natural demonstration. You copy this comparison word for word, sic ut musica credit principia tradita sibi ab arithmetica, while gradually realizing that Aquinas is constructing a hierarchy of a knowledge in which theology occupies a middle position between human science and divine omniscience. But the really devastating part is when you start to grasp the implications of what you're copying. Aquinas isn't just arguing that theology is legitimate knowledge, he's arguing that it's the highest form of knowledge accessible to human beings. He's claiming that revealed truth provides a more certain foundation for understanding reality than anything achievable through pure reason. And he's doing this using Aristotelian logical methods to prove that Aristotelian logical methods have limitations. As you work through the replies to the objections, the philosophical sophistication becomes overwhelming. The first reply explains that while the principles of sacred doctrine aren't self-evident to human reason, they are self-evident to divine knowledge, and sacred doctrine derives its certainty from divine rather than human evidence. This requires understanding distinctions between different types of evidence, different kinds of certainty, and different relationships between knower and known that would challenge professional philosophers. The second reply addresses the relationship between universal principles and particular applications by arguing that sacred doctrine treats particular events as instances of universal truths about divine providence, human salvation, and the relationship between time and eternity. You copy Aquinas' explanation that sacred doctrine is magis unequam aliquae scientiae humane, more unified than any human science, because it views all reality from the single perspective of divine truth. The third reply deals with the question of whether sacred doctrine is speculative or practical by arguing that it's primarily speculative because it treats of divine things, but it's also practical because it directs human action toward ultimate beatitude. The distinction requires understanding the relationship between contemplation and action, between knowledge pursued for its own sake and knowledge aimed at the perfect life. By afternoon, you've copied approximately 8 pages of question 1, and your head is spinning with concepts you can barely pronounce, let alone understand. Aquinas writes about divine knowledge as if he's personally experienced it. He discusses the relationship between time and eternity with the confidence of someone who has measured both. He analyzes the mechanics of divine providence with the precision of a master craftsman describing his own tools. And you're supposed to copy all this without making errors, which means you need to understand it well enough to recognize when you've made a mistake that disrupts the logical flow. You need to know the difference between essential and accidental properties, between univocal and analogical predication, between formal and objective concepts. You need to follow arguments that move through multiple levels of abstraction, citing authorities from across centuries of intellectual tradition. The vocabulary alone is enough to break your brain. Terms like habitus scientificus, demonstratio propter quid, cognitio per causis, and analogia entis represent technical philosophical concepts that require generations to develop. You copy them with mechanical precision while having approximately the same level of comprehension as a highly literate parrot. Question 2 asks whether sacred doctrine is one science or many, which sounds simple until Aquinas begins explaining the unity of perspective that makes sacred doctrine more coherent than any human science. He argues that all the various topics treated in sacred doctrine, God, angels, humans, creation, salvation, moral law, sacraments, are unified because they're all viewed from the single perspective of divine truth. It's like looking at a vast landscape from a mountaintop rather than examining individual trees from ground level. You copy his explanation that diversitas materialis habituorum non diversificat scientiam, quando est una ratio formalis respectuorum. Material diversity of objects doesn't make sciences different when there's one formal perspective regarding them. This requires understanding scholastic distinctions between material and formal objects, between what a science studies and the perspective from which it studies them. Philosophy studies being from the perspective of natural reason. Sacred doctrine studies everything from the perspective of divine revelation. Question 3 deals with whether sacred doctrine is practical or speculative, requiring distinctions between different types of knowledge and different relationships between understanding and action. Aquinas argues that sacred doctrine is primarily speculative because its principal concern is divine truth, but it's secondarily practical because it guides human actions toward beatitude. You copy his careful analysis of how contemplative knowledge of God leads naturally to practical wisdom about how to live. The complexity deepens with every paragraph. Aquinas discusses the relationship between contemplation and action, between vita contemplativa and vita activa, concepts that involve understanding different approaches to human perfection. Some people achieve their highest fulfillment through pure contemplation of divine truth. Others find their calling in active service guided by contemplative insights. Sacred doctrine serves both purposes because knowledge of God both satisfies the intellect and guides the will. Question 4 introduces even more challenging territory, where the sacred doctrine is argumentative. This sounds like a simple question, until you realize Aquinas is dealing with fundamental issues about the relationship between faith and reason. Can theology prove its conclusions through logical argument, or must it simply assert truths based on divine authority? How can human reasoning engage with truths that exceed natural understanding? Aquinas' answer is characteristically subtle. Sacred doctrine does use arguments, but not to prove the articles of faith, which are accepted on divine authority. Rather, it uses arguments to defend the faith against objections, to draw out the implications of revealed truths, and to show that faith is reasonable even when it exceeds reason. You copy his distinction between demonstrating the truth of faith, impossible, and defending the reasonableness of faith, necessary and possible. The technical vocabulary becomes increasingly demanding. Terms like preambula fidei, preambles of faith, motiva credibilitatis, motives of credibility, and demonstratio quia versus demonstratio propter quid, demonstration that something exists versus demonstration why it exists, represent sophisticated epistemological distinctions that took centuries to develop. You preserve these concepts with mechanical accuracy while possessing minimal understanding of their philosophical significance. Question 5 asks whether sacred doctrine is nobler than other sciences, opening into comparative analysis of different forms of knowledge. Aquinas argues that sacred doctrine surpasses all other sciences both in certainty and dignity. Its certainty exceeds that of natural sciences because it rests on divine rather than human knowledge. Its dignity exceeds that of other sciences because it treats of God not merely as first cause, like natural theology, but as the object of beatific vision. You copy his explanation that sacred doctrine is certia, more certain than any human science because divine knowledge is more reliable than human reasoning, and dignior more noble, because it concerns the highest possible object of knowledge. But this creates its own puzzles. If sacred doctrine is so certain, why do people disagree about theological questions? If it's so noble, why does it seem to require faith rather than demonstration? Aquinas' responses involve complex distinctions between the certainty of sacred doctrine's principles, absolute, and the certainty of human understanding of those principles, limited by natural capacities. Divine truth is perfectly certain in itself, but human reception of divine truth is affected by the limitations of finite intellects. The nobility of sacred doctrine lies not in its accessibility to human reason, but in the sublimity of its object and the supernatural character of its principles. Question 6 addresses whether sacred doctrine is wisdom, introducing Aristotelian distinctions between different intellectual virtues. Wisdom, according to Aristotle, is knowledge of the highest causes and first principles. Sacred doctrine clearly deals with the highest possible cause, God and the most fundamental principles, divine truth. But can something that depends on faith rather than demonstration qualify as genuine wisdom? Aquinas' answer involves showing how sacred doctrine fulfills and surpasses the Aristotelian definition of wisdom. Natural wisdom achieves knowledge of the highest causes discoverable by human reason. Sacred doctrine achieves knowledge of the highest cause as revealed by divine authority. Natural wisdom judges all other sciences by reference to first principles. Sacred doctrine judges all other knowledge by reference to divine truth. You copy page after page of increasingly complex argumentation, your hand moving mechanically across the parchment, while your mind struggles to follow logical structures that operate at the outer limits of human comprehension. Each question builds on previous distinctions, introducing new technical vocabulary and more sophisticated philosophical analysis. The physical challenges of copying are nothing compared to the intellectual vertigo of preserving ideas that exceed your capacity for comprehension. Your hand cramps from holding the quill, but your mind cramps from trying to follow arguments that operate at the boundaries of human reasoning. You're copying Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God without really understanding what constitutes a proof. You're reproducing his analysis of divine attributes without grasping how human language can meaningfully describe infinite affection. By the time you finish your second day, you've preserved roughly 15 pages of the most sophisticated theological reasoning ever written, and you understand perhaps one argument in 20. You've successfully copied discussions of divine knowledge, eternal truth, and perfect beatitude while your temporal understanding remains thoroughly finite and confused. Tomorrow you'll begin the famous 5 ways, Aquinas' demonstrations that God exists. 5 arguments that represent the pinnacle of medieval philosophical achievement, each one requiring careful attention to logical structure, technical vocabulary, and metaphysical assumptions that you're only beginning to recognize, let alone understand. The first way argues from motion to an unmoved mover. The second way argues from efficient causation to a first cause. The third way argues from contingency to necessary existence. The fourth way argues from degrees of perfection to perfect being. The fifth way argues from the governance of things to divine intelligence. You'll copy all 5 arguments with meticulous care while possessing roughly the philosophical sophistication necessary to understand that they're supposed to prove something important about God's existence. As you prepare for Vespers, you reflect on the strange nature of your calling. You're spending your life preserving the greatest philosophical achievements of your age, while lacking the intellectual preparation to fully appreciate what you're preserving. You're copying arguments about eternal happiness while your temporal understanding remains thoroughly limited. You're reproducing discussions of divine perfection while your human comprehension stays resolutely finite. But perhaps this is precisely the point. Perhaps the preservation of wisdom requires exactly this kind of humble service. Perhaps the most profound truths can only be transmitted through the faithful reproduction of texts too important to lose and too complex to be fully grasped by their copyists. Perhaps your limited understanding isn't an obstacle to preserving Aquinas' insights, but rather the necessary condition that ensures his arguments will be transmitted exactly as he wrote them, without the corruptions that might result from scribes who thought they understood well enough to improve upon the original. The intellectual challenges will only intensify. The Summa contains questions about the nature of angels, the mechanics of divine providence, the relationship between soul and body, the foundations of moral law, and the ultimate destiny of human beings. Each topic requires familiarity with philosophical traditions stretching back to ancient Greece, theological developments spanning centuries of Christian thought, and logical sophistication that pushes the boundaries of human reasoning. And you'll copy it all, word by word, argument by argument, preserving philosophical achievements that won't be fully appreciated for centuries while possessing just enough understanding to recognize the magnitude of your own intellectual limitations. This is how the greatest philosophical work of the Middle Ages was transmitted to future generations, not through perfect comprehension, but through perfect transcription by monks who understood just enough to know they were preserving something far greater than their own capacity to understand. Your third day arrives with the promise of intellectual devastation. Today you begin copying Aquinas' famous 5 ways, his demonstrations for the existence of God. These aren't simple biblical assertions or mystical proclamations. These are rigorous philosophical proofs that attempt to establish God's existence through pure reason, using principles that even atheist philosophers would have to accept as logically valid. Brother Marcus approaches your desk with what might be enthusiasm or sympathy. Today, Brother Anselm, you will copy the foundation of all rational theology. Master Thomas presents 5 demonstrations that God exists, each one building from observable facts about the natural world to necessary conclusions about divine reality. The arguments are logically airtight, philosophically sophisticated, and completely incomprehensible to anyone without extensive training in Aristotelian metaphysics. The first way begins innocuously enough. The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. You copy the Latin prima via est, quae sumiter ex parte motus, while trying to remember what you learned about motion in your basic education. Things move. Sometimes they stop moving. Occasionally they start moving again. Surely this can't be the foundation for proving God's existence. But then Aquinas begins his analysis, and you realize you've entered a philosophical labyrinth that makes your previous copying seem simple by comparison. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. So far, so reasonable. Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, still tracking. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion. And there it is, potentiality. You're copying one of the most fundamental concepts in Aristotelian philosophy, a distinction between what something actually is and what it could potentially become. A cold piece of metal is potentially hot. A living person is potentially dead. Motion, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, is the actualization of potentiality. But nothing can actualize its own potentiality, because that would require it to be both actual and potential in the same respect simultaneously, which is contradictory. You copy the technical language mechanically. Nihil enim movetur, nisi secundum quod est in potentia ad illud ad quod movetur. Nothing is moved except in so far as it is in potentiality toward that to which it is moved. The vocabulary of potency in act, matter and form, substance and accident flows through your quill, while your understanding struggles to keep pace with concepts that represent centuries of philosophical development. The argument continues with relentless logic. If everything in motion is moved by another, and that mover is itself in motion, then it too must be moved by another. This creates a series of movers, but an infinite series is impossible, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no subsequent movers. Therefore, there must be a first mover that is itself unmoved, and this everyone understands to be God. You copy the conclusion et hoc omnes intelligent diem, and this everyone understands to be God, while privately wondering if everyone includes medieval monks who can barely follow the logical structure of the argument they're transcribing. The first way requires understanding not just the concepts of potency in act, but also the principle that infinite regress in essentially ordered series is impossible, the distinction between per se and per accidens causation, and the metaphysical structure of motion itself. The argument assumes familiarity with Aristotle's physics, his analysis of change and motion that took decades to develop and centuries to refine. You're copying references to concepts like substantial form, prime matter, efficient causation, and final causation that represent sophisticated philosophical distinctions you've never studied. Each technical term carries the weight of extensive philosophical analysis that you're reproducing without comprehending. The second way argues from efficient causation, and if anything it's more technically demanding than the first. In the world of sense we find there is an order of efficient causes. You copy the Latin while trying to recall what you know about causation. One thing causes another, which causes another, and so on. But Aquinas' analysis goes far deeper than simple observation. Efficient causation in Aristotelian terms refers to the agent that brings something into existence or produces a change. But not all causal series are the same. Some are accidentally ordered. Your grandfather caused your father, who caused you. But your grandfather doesn't need to exist for you to exist now. Others are essentially ordered. The hand moves the stick, which moves the stone, and all three must exist simultaneously for the motion to occur. You copy Aquinas' argument that essentially ordered efficient causes cannot proceed to infinity, because in such a series, if there's no first cause, there are no intermediate causes, and therefore no ultimate effect. But we observe effects, so there must be a first efficient cause, which everyone calls God. The logic seems airtight, but it requires understanding metaphysical distinctions that you're encountering for the first time. The technical vocabulary becomes overwhelming. Terms like causa efficiens per se, causa efficiens per accidens, ordo essentialis, and regresses in infinitum represent concepts that require generations of philosophical development. You copy them with mechanical precision, while having roughly the metaphysical sophistication of someone who thinks causation means one thing happens after another. The third way, from contingency and necessity, pushes your comprehension to its breaking point. Aquinas begins with the observation that some things in nature are contingent, they come into existence and pass away. If everything were contingent, then at some time nothing would have existed, because contingent things don't exist always. But if nothing existed, then nothing could come into existence, because what doesn't exist can only be brought into existence by something that does exist. You copy the argument while your brain slowly dissolves from logical overload. The third way requires understanding the distinction between necessary and contingent existence, the principle that everything contingent depends on something necessary, and the difference between things that are necessary through themselves versus things that are necessary through another. By the time you reach Aquinas' conclusion that there must be something that is necessary through itself, which everyone calls God, you're copying words that might as well be in ancient Egyptian. The argument involves complex modal logic, reasoning about possibility, necessity, and impossibility. That wouldn't be fully formalized until the 20th century. You're preserving discussions of different types of necessity, various forms of contingency, and the relationship between temporal existence and logical necessity that represents some of the most sophisticated metaphysical reasoning ever developed. Aquinas distinguishes between things that are possible esse et non esse, possible to exist and not to exist, and things that are necessi essis, necessary to exist. But then he further distinguishes between things that are necessary through another, necessi esse ab alio, and things that are necessary through themselves, necessi esse per se. You copy these distinctions while possessing approximately the modal intuitions of a medieval peasant who thinks necessary means really important. The fourth way argues from degrees of perfection, introducing concepts of analogical predication that would challenge professional philosophers. Aquinas observes that we find things more or less good, true, noble, and perfect. But comparative terms require a standard of absolute perfection. There must be something that is most true, most good, most noble, and consequently most perfect in being. You copy the Latin invenitur enim in rebus aliquid magis et minus bonum, id verum, id noble, while trying to grasp how degrees of perfection could prove God's existence. The argument assumes understanding of Platonic participation theory, Aristotelian concepts of formal causation, and scholastic distinctions between univocal and analogical predication. When Aquinas concludes that the most perfect being is the cause of all perfection in other things, you are preserving an argument that synthesizes multiple philosophical traditions you've never studied. The fourth way requires grasping the principle that om quod dicita per participationem, reducita ad aliquid quod dicita per essentiam. Everything that is said by participation is reduced to something that is said by essence. This involves understanding how finite perfections participate in infinite perfection, how analogical language can bridge the gap between created and uncreated being, and how causal relationships can exist between different orders of reality. You copy discussions of bonum per essentium, good by essence, versus bonum per participationem, good by participation in per se, being through itself, versus ens per aliud, being through another, and perfectum simpliciter, absolutely perfect, versus perfectum secundum quid, perfect in some respect. Each distinction represents sophisticated metaphysical analysis that assumes familiarity with philosophical traditions stretching back to Plato and Aristotle. The fifth way argues from the governance of things, observing that natural things lacking intelligence appear to act purposefully towards specific ends. Arrows hit targets because they're directed by archers. Natural processes achieve beneficial results because they're directed by divine intelligence. You copy the argument while wondering if you've ever had a purposeful thought about the relationship between intelligence and teleological order. The argument from governance involves understanding Aristotelian final causation, the principle that natural processes are directed towards specific ends or goals. But this raises complex questions about the relationship between intelligence and purpose, consciousness and teleology, divine direction and natural necessity. You copy Aquinas' analysis while lacking the philosophical preparation to evaluate whether natural purposes require supernatural intelligence. Aquinas argues that omniaque carent cognitione non tendant in finem nisi directa bellique cognoscenti et intelligent. All things that lack knowledge do not tend toward an end, unless directed by something knowing and intelligent. This requires understanding how unconscious natural processes can exhibit purposeful behavior, how final causation operates in inanimate objects, and how divine intelligence can direct natural operations without violating their autonomy. Each of the 5 ways concludes with et hoc decimus diem, and this we call God, but by the time you've copied all 5 demonstrations, you realize you've preserved philosophical arguments that would require years of study to fully understand. You're reproducing proofs for God's existence while possessing roughly the theological sophistication of a devout but philosophically untrained peasant. The complexity doesn't end with the 5 ways. Question 3 of the Summa asks whether God exists. but questions 4 through 26 analyze what God is like, introducing concepts that push human language to its breaking point. How do you describe infinite perfection using finite words? How do you explain divine simplicity, eternality, immutability, and infinity to minds that only understand composite, temporal, changeable, and finite things? Question 4 asks whether God is perfect, requiring you to copy discussions of different types of perfection, the relationship between perfection and actuality, and metaphysical analyses of unlimited being. You preserve Aquinas' argument that God is perfect because God is pure actuality without any limiting potentiality, while privately wondering if perfection is something you could recognize if you encountered it. Aquinas defines perfection as qui nihil est modo perfectionis sibi competenti, that to which nothing is lacking of the mode of perfection befitting it. But divine perfection is perfectio prima, first perfection, which lacks nothing whatsoever, and serves as the source of all other perfections. You copy discussions of perfectio pura, pure perfection, versus perfectio mixta, mixed perfection, perfectio absoluta, absolute perfection, versus perfectio relativa, relative perfection, while having roughly the metaphysical sophistication necessary to distinguish between really good and pretty good. Question 5 deals with divine goodness, introducing the transcendental properties of being. According to scholastic philosophy, being, unity, truth, and goodness are convertible. Wherever you find one, you find the others. But divine goodness is not just the highest instance of created goodness, it's goodness itself, the source and measure of all created goodness. You copy Aquinas' analysis of how divine goodness relates to created goodness through participation, exemplarity, and efficient causation. Divine goodness is the exemplar cause of all created goodness, the pattern after which created goods are formed, the efficient cause of all created goodness, the power that brings created goods into existence, and the final cause of all created goodness, the goal toward which created goods are directed. The technical vocabulary becomes increasingly abstract. Terms like bonum per essentium, bonum fontale, bonum diffusivum sui, and bonum commune represent concepts that push the boundaries of human language. You're copying discussions of how infinite goodness can be the source of finite goodness, how absolute simplicity can be the cause of infinite diversity, how unchanging perfection can be the origin of temporal development. Question 6 asks whether God is infinite, requiring understanding of different types of infinity, the relationship between infinity and perfection, and metaphysical analyses of unlimited being. Aquinas distinguishes between infinitum materiale, material infinity, and infinitum formale, formal infinity, between infinitum potentiale, potential infinity, and infinitum actual, actual infinity. Divine infinity is formal and actual, unlimited perfection rather than unlimited quantity. You copy discussions of how infinity relates to simplicity, perfection, and actuality, while your finite understanding struggles with concepts that exceed temporal categories. How can something be infinitely simple? How can unlimited perfection be more perfect than limited perfection? How can actual infinity avoid the logical problems that seem to affect potential infinity? Question 7 deals with God's existence in things, introducing the theological distinction between divine transcendence and divine immanence. God is entirely beyond creation, transcendent, but also intimately present in all created things, immanent. You copy Aquinas' explanation that God exists in all things by essence, power, and presence, while trying to understand how something can be both completely other and completely present simultaneously. The argument requires understanding how infinite being can be related to finite being without being limited by that relationship, how eternal actuality can be present in temporal development without being affected by change, how absolute simplicity can be intimately involved in infinite complexity without losing its unity. Question 8 analyzes divine immutability, the doctrine that God cannot change. This seems straightforward until Aquinas begins explaining why immutability is compatible with divine activity, how an unchanging God can create temporal things, and why immutability represents perfection rather than limitation. You copy arguments about the relationship between being and becoming, eternity and time, absolute and relative that require understanding metaphysical categories you're encountering for the first time. Aquinas argues that on mod quod movita, quantum ad aliquid est in potentia, everything that is moved is in some respect in potentiality. But God is pure actuality without any potentiality, so God cannot change. Yet this doesn't mean God is static or inactive. Divine immutability is compatible with divine creativity, providence, and love because these represent relationships that are real in creatures but not in God. Question 9 discusses eternity, and here your intellectual inadequacy becomes almost comical. Aquinas defines eternity as simultanea tota, et perfecta possessia vitae interminabilis, the simultaneously whole and perfect possession of unending life. You copy the technical definition while having approximately the same understanding of simultaneity, totality, and perfection that a medieval peasant has of quantum physics. The analysis of eternity requires grasping the difference between time as the measure of motion and eternity as the measure of unchanging existence. Temporal things exist successively, past, present, future. Eternal things exist all at once, their entire existence is simultaneously present. You copy Aquinas' explanation that divine eternity contains all temporal moments without being contained by any of them, while your temporal understanding remains thoroughly confused about how all at once could include past and future. Aquinas distinguishes between tempus, time, avum, aviternity, and eternitas, eternity. Physical things exist in time, experiencing successive duration. Spiritual substances like angels exist in eviternity, experiencing duration but not succession. God exists in eternity, experiencing neither succession nor duration but possessing all life simultaneously and perfectly. You copied discussions of how eternal knowledge can encompass temporal events, how eternal will can be related to temporal effects, how eternal love can be directed toward changing creatures. Each analysis requires understanding the relationship between different modes of existence, different types of duration, different forms of perfection that represent some of the most sophisticated metaphysical reasoning ever developed. By your 6th day of copying, you've preserved approximately 60 pages of the most sophisticated rational theology ever written, and you understand perhaps one concept in 50. You're successfully reproducing arguments about divine perfection, infinite goodness, eternal knowledge, and absolute simplicity while your finite understanding remains thoroughly relative and composite. The irony becomes inescapable. You're spending your days copying discussions of eternal happiness while experiencing temporal suffering. You're preserving arguments about divine simplicity while your life becomes increasingly complex and difficult. You're reproducing analyses of infinite perfection while your human limitations become more apparent with every cramped finger and aching back. But perhaps this is exactly appropriate. Perhaps understanding divine nature requires precisely this kind of intellectual humility. Perhaps the most profound truths about God can only be preserved through the faithful service of minds that are honest about their own limitations. Perhaps your copying of arguments you can't fully grasp is itself a form of worship, not the worship of comprehension, but the worship of faithful transmission. Tomorrow you'll begin the questions about divine knowledge, how God knows all things simultaneously, how divine knowledge relates to temporal events, how divine ideas serve as the exemplars for all created things. You'll copy discussions of divine omniscience that require understanding the relationship between knowledge and existence, universals and particulars, eternal and temporal that would challenge the greatest philosophers. This is how divine wisdom was transmitted through human limitation, not despite the intellectual inadequacy of its copyists, but through their faithful recognition of what they were unable to understand. Your 7th day begins with a philosophical crisis that makes your previous intellectual vertigo seem like a gentle breeze. Today you tackle questions 14 through 18 of the Summa, Aquinas' analysis of divine knowledge. If copying arguments about God's existence nearly broke your brain, copying arguments about how God knows everything simultaneously, eternally, and infallibly might finish the job entirely. Brother Marcus arrives with his customary blend of encouragement and barely concealed pity. Today, Brother Anselm, you will copy Master Thomas's exploration of divine omniscience. How does God know all things, past, present, and future, in a single eternal act? How does divine knowledge relate to temporal events without being changed by them? How can God know contingent futures without destroying human freedom? These questions have puzzled the greatest theologians for centuries, and you'll be preserving their most sophisticated answers while possessing roughly the epistemological sophistication of a well-educated turnip. Question 14 asks simply whether there is knowledge in God. This sounds like an easy question until you realize that divine knowledge operates according to principles that shatter every assumption about how knowledge normally works. Human knowledge is passive. We receive information from objects outside ourselves. Divine knowledge is active. God knows things by causing them to exist. Human knowledge is temporal. We learn new things and forget old ones. Divine knowledge is eternal. God knows all things simultaneously in a single unchanging act. You copy Aquinas' initial arguments, beginning with the principle that God is pure actuality and therefore possesses all perfections. Knowledge represents a perfection, so God must possess knowledge in the highest possible degree. But divine knowledge cannot be like human knowledge, which involves receiving forms from external objects. God has no potentiality to be actualized by anything outside divine nature. The Latin flows through your quill while your understanding staggers behind. Scientias quaedam perfectio, undeo portet quod in Deo sit scientia. Knowledge is a certain perfection, therefore it is necessary that there be knowledge in God. But then Aquinas begins explaining how divine knowledge differs from every type of knowledge you've ever imagined. Divine knowledge is identical with divine essence. God doesn't have knowledge the way creatures have knowledge, as an accidental property added to their substance. God is knowledge, just as God is existence, goodness, truth, and every other divine attribute. You copy discussions of divine simplicity that require understanding how all divine attributes are really identical with each other and with divine essence itself, while your composite understanding struggles with concepts of absolute unity. Question 15 analyzes divine ideas, the eternal exemplars according to which God creates all things. This introduces Platonic elements into Aristotelian metaphysics that would give professional philosophers headaches for centuries. Aquinas argues that God knows creatures not by receiving information from them, but by knowing divine essence as imitable in various ways. Divine ideas are not distinct thoughts in God's mind, but different ways creatures can participate in divine perfection. You copy the technical vocabulary of exemplar causation while having approximately the same understanding of Platonic participation theory that a medieval peasantess of advanced mathematics. Terms like ratio producendi, forma exemplaris similitudins rerum, and participatio entis represent sophisticated philosophical concepts that synthesize traditions you've never studied. God knows creatures by knowing how divine essence can be participated in limited ways, but this knowledge is identical with divine essence itself. The argument requires understanding how one simple eternal act of knowledge can encompass infinite possible creatures, how unchanging divine ideas can serve as patterns for changing temporal things, how absolute unity can be the source of unlimited diversity. You preserve discussions of divine creativity that operate at the intersection of metaphysics, epistemology, and theology while possessing minimal preparation in any of these fields. Question 16 deals with whether God's knowledge is speculative or practical, introducing distinctions that require understanding different relationships between knowledge and action. Speculative knowledge seeks truth for its own sake. Practical knowledge aims at producing effects. Divine knowledge is primarily speculative because God knows divine essence perfectly, but it's also practical because God knows creatures as things to be produced through divine creative activity. You copy Aquinas' analysis of how divine knowledge can be both speculative and practical simultaneously. how eternal knowledge can direct temporal creation, how unchanging wisdom can guide changing providence. The argument assumes familiarity with Aristotelian distinctions between theoretical and practical wisdom, contemplative and active intellectual virtues, knowledge pursued for understanding and knowledge aimed at production. The technical complexity intensifies with every paragraph. Aquinas discusses scientia visionis, knowledge of vision, versus scientia simplicis intelligentiae, knowledge of simple intelligence, cognitio speculativa versus cognitio practica, intellectus practicus versus intellectus speculativus. Each distinction represents centuries of philosophical development that you're reproducing without comprehending. Question 17 asks whether God's knowledge is variable, and here the analysis becomes almost incomprehensible. Divine knowledge is absolutely unchanging because it's identical with divine essence, which admits no potentiality for change. But God knows temporal events as they occur in time, contingent events as they happen contingently, future events as they will exist in the future. How can unchanging knowledge encompass changing reality? Aquinas' answer involves distinctions between different modes of divine knowledge that push human language to its breaking point. God knows all temporal events eternally, not by learning new information as events occur, but by possessing eternal knowledge that encompasses all temporal moments simultaneously. Divine knowledge doesn't change when temporal events occur, rather, temporal events occur according to eternal divine knowledge. You copied discussions of the relationship between eternity and time, immutability and providence, eternal knowledge, and temporal freedom, while your temporal understanding remains thoroughly confused about how eternal knowledge of temporal events could be anything but contradictory. The argument requires grasping how divine eternity can contain all temporal moments without being contained by any of them, how eternal knowledge can be infallibly certain about contingent futures without necessitating them. Question 18 analyzes divine knowledge of infinite things, introducing mathematical and metaphysical puzzles that wouldn't be resolved until modern set theory. Can infinite knowledge know infinite objects? How does divine omniscience relate to actually infinite collections? Can God know all possible creatures, even though there are infinitely many possible creatures? Aquinas argues that divine knowledge comprehends actually infinite objects because divine knowledge is itself infinite. But this raises complex questions about different types of infinity, the relationship between potential and actual infinity, the coherence of infinite collections. You copy discussions of infinitum actu versus infinitum potentia, multitudo infinitia versus magnitudo infinita, while possessing roughly the mathematical sophistication necessary to count to 20 without removing your sandals. The analysis extends to divine knowledge of future contingents, events that might or might not happen depending on free choices yet to be made. How can God know infallibly what free agents will choose without destroying their freedom? If divine knowledge is certain, doesn't that make future events necessary rather than contingent? You copy Aquinas' careful distinctions between different types of necessity, various forms of certainty, and multiple modes of contingency. Divine knowledge is infallibly certain, but this doesn't impose necessity on the objects known. Contingent events remain contingent even when known eternally by divine omniscience. The certainty belongs to divine knowledge, not to the temporal events themselves. The technical vocabulary becomes increasingly specialized. Terms like contingentia futura, necessitas coactionis, necessitas immutabilitatis certitudo infallibilis, and contingentia liberi arbitri represent sophisticated philosophical distinctions that require understanding the relationships between knowledge and necessity, eternity and freedom, divine omniscience and human responsibility. By the time you reach the questions about divine will, questions 19 through 24, your intellectual exhaustion has reached new depths. If divine knowledge seemed complex, divine volition introduces complications that would challenge the greatest philosophers. How does God will things? What is the relationship between divine knowledge and divine will? How can God will contingent events without being contingent? How can divine will be the cause of all things without being necessitated by anything? Question 19 asks whether there is will in God, beginning with the principle that will follows upon intellectual apprehension of good. Since God possesses perfect knowledge and is perfect goodness, God must possess perfect will. But divine will, like divine knowledge, operates according to principles that transcend ordinary understanding. You copy Aquinas' analysis of how divine will differs from human will, while your understanding struggles with concepts that require familiarity with philosophical psychology, metaphysics of goodness, and theology of divine attributes. Human will can be moved by external goods, can choose between competing options, can change its intentions over time. Divine will is moved by nothing external, chooses eternally and immutably, and is itself the source of all created goodness. Divine will is necessarily directed toward divine goodness, but freely directed toward created goods. God cannot will against divine nature. Divine goodness is the necessary object of divine will. But God can will or not will any created good, because no created good is necessary for divine perfection. You copy discussions of divine freedom that require understanding how necessity and freedom can coexist in divine will, how perfect goodness can be the source of contingent creation. Question 20 deals with whether God wills things other than God, introducing problems about the relationship between divine self-love and divine love for creatures. Aquinas argues that God primarily wills divine goodness, but secondarily wills created goods as participations in divine goodness. Divine will extends to creatures not because God needs them, but because God wills to communicate divine goodness through creation. You copy analyses of how divine will can be directed toward finite goods without being limited by them, how infinite goodness can be the source of limited participations, how eternal will can be the cause of temporal effects. The argument requires understanding how divine transcendence is compatible with divine immanence, how absolute perfection can be related to relative perfections without being diminished. Question 21 analyzes whether God wills necessarily what God wills, introducing modal logic problems that wouldn't be fully formalized for centuries. Divine will is necessary with respect to its primary object, divine goodness, but free with respect to secondary objects, created goods. God necessarily wills divine existence and goodness, but freely wills the existence of any particular created universe. The distinctions become increasingly subtle. Aquinas discusses necessitas naturalis versus necessitas coactionis, voluntas et natura versus voluntas et libera, bonum necessarium versus bonum contingens. You copy these technical terms while having roughly the modal intuitions necessary to distinguish between has to happen and really should happen. Question 22 deals with divine providence, how God directs all things toward their proper ends. This introduces teleological concepts that require understanding the relationship between divine will, natural causation, and creaturely freedom. Providence is not merely divine foreknowledge of future events, but divine ordering of all things toward the universal good. You copy Aquinas' analysis of how divine providence can direct natural events without violating natural causation, guide human actions without destroying human freedom, order contingent events without necessitating them. Divine providence operates through secondary causes, natural processes, human choices, angelic activities, while remaining the primary cause that directs everything toward ultimate perfection. The argument requires understanding how eternal providence can encompass temporal development, how universal ordering can respect particular natures, how divine causation can work through created causation without competing with it. You preserve discussions of divine government that synthesize metaphysics, natural philosophy, moral philosophy, and theology while possessing minimal preparation in any of these disciplines. Question 23 introduces divine predestination, perhaps the most controversial topic in all of theology. How does God's eternal will relate to the salvation of rational creatures? If God predestines some to eternal happiness, what about those who are not predestined? How can divine justice be reconciled with divine mercy in the distribution of eternal destinies? Aquinas' treatment is characteristically careful and technically sophisticated. Predestination is part of divine providence, specifically God's eternal plan for leading rational creatures to their supernatural end. But predestination doesn't impose necessity on human choices. Divine eternal willing is compatible with creaturely temporal freedom because eternity contains all temporal moments without being contained by them. You copy discussions of predestinatio, reprobatio, repulum gratiae, gratiae, meritum, and gloria, while your understanding of the relationship between divine sovereignty and non-responsibility remains thoroughly confused. The technical vocabulary of grace, merit, and glory requires familiarity with theological traditions that assume extensive philosophical preparation. Question 24 deals with the Book of Life, the record of those predestined to eternal happiness. This raises questions about the relationship between divine knowledge, divine will, and human destiny that have puzzled theologians for centuries. Is the Book of Life unchangeable? Can names be added or removed? How does divine immutability relate to human mutability in matters of salvation? Your copying hand moves mechanically across the parchment while your mind reels from concepts that exceed ordinary comprehension. You're preserving discussions of eternal predestination while experiencing temporal uncertainty, copying arguments about unchanging divine, or while fluctuates between dedication and despair, reproducing analyses of divine omniscience, while remaining thoroughly ignorant about most of what you're copying. By your 10th day, you've preserved approximately 100 pages of the most sophisticated rational theology ever written, and your understanding has progressed from minimal to slightly less minimal. You're successfully reproducing arguments about divine knowledge, will, providence, and predestination, while possessing roughly the theological sophistication necessary to understand that these topics are supposed to be important. The physical toll has become undeniable. Your right hand has developed a permanent curve from gripping the quill. Your back aches constantly from hunching over manuscripts. Your eyes water from the strain of reading medieval handwriting by candlelight. Your neck throbs from looking back and forth between original and copy. These are the occupational hazards of preserving eternal wisdom through temporal labor. But the intellectual toll is even more severe. You're spending your days copying the most profound theological insights ever developed while lacking the philosophical preparation to evaluate them. You're preserving arguments about divine perfection while experiencing human limitation, reproducing discussions of eternal happiness while enduring temporal suffering, copying analyses of divine simplicity while your life becomes increasingly complex. The irony becomes overwhelming. Aquinas writes about divine knowledge that encompasses all truth simultaneously and eternally. You copy his arguments one letter at a time, understanding perhaps one concept in 100. He discusses divine will that moves all things without being moved by anything. You reproduce his analysis while your own will is constantly buffeted by fatigue, frustration, and doubt. Yet perhaps this is exactly appropriate. Perhaps the preservation of divine wisdom requires precisely this kind of intellectual humility. Perhaps copying arguments about divine transcendence while experiencing human limitation is itself a form of theological education. Perhaps your inadequate understanding of Aquinas' insights doesn't disqualify you from preserving them, but rather demonstrates why they need to be preserved for minds better prepared to appreciate them. Tomorrow you'll begin copying questions about divine power, divine happiness, and the divine persons of the Trinity. The intellectual challenges will continue to intensify as you move deeper into systematic theology. Each question will build on previous arguments, introduce new technical vocabulary, and require familiarity with philosophical traditions that represent centuries of development. And you'll copy it all word by word, argument by argument, preserving the greatest systematic theology ever written while possessing just enough understanding to recognize the magnitude of what you're unable to comprehend. This is how divine wisdom was transmitted through human limitation, not despite the intellectual inadequacy of its preservers, but through their faithful recognition of their own limitations in the face of truths that exceed finite understanding. 18 months have passed since you first opened Aquinas' Summa Theologica in the frigid scriptorium of St. Denis. Your back has permanently curved into the shape of intellectual devotion. Your right hand has developed calluses that would impress a stone mason. Your eyes strain to focus on anything more than 3 feet away. And somehow, miraculously, disastrously, you've actually finished copying the entire work. 3,000 pages, 512 questions, 2,600,000 words of the most sophisticated philosophical theology ever written. Arguments that synthesize Aristotelian metaphysics with Christian doctrine, proofs for God's existence that would challenge modern logicians, analysis of divine attributes that push human language beyond its normal capacity, discussions of moral law that founded entire traditions of ethical reasoning, and explorations of human destiny that promise eternal happiness through temporal suffering. Brother Marcus examines your final pages with the meticulous attention he's shown throughout the project. The last question of the Summa deals with the resurrection of the body, how human beings will be restored to perfect physical existence in the afterlife. You've spent the morning copying Aquinas' arguments about whether resurrected bodies will be incorruptible, whether they'll possess supernatural abilities, whether they'll experience pleasure and pain, whether they'll need food and sleep. The irony is almost unbearable. After 18 months of physical deterioration from copying arguments about eternal perfection, you've concluded by reproducing discussions of how human bodies will be perfected in the resurrection. Your cramped fingers have preserved arguments about supernatural agility. Your aching back has transmitted discussions of spiritual bodies that will never experience fatigue. Your strained eyes have copied analyses of glorified vision that will see divine truth directly. It is finished, Brother Marcus declares, and for a moment you're not sure whether he's referring to your copying project or your physical existence. Both feel equally depleted. You have preserved Master Thomas's complete systematic theology for future generations of scholars. The work will be sent to Cluny, where it will be copied again, and those copies will generate further copies, until Aquinas' sites reach every monastery, cathedral school, and university in Christendom. You set down your quill for the final time, flexing fingers that no longer seem to belong to you. The sensation is strange, relief mixed with emptiness, accomplishment mixed with exhaustion, pride mixed with the growing realization that you've spent 18 months copying arguments you still don't understand. You've successfully preserved the greatest philosophical achievement of your age while possessing roughly the intellectual sophistication necessary to recognize that it's supposed to be important. The Summa Theologica sits before you in 2 neat stacks. The original manuscript that will return to its home at the Dominican Priory in Paris, and your copy that will travel to Cluny to begin its own journey through medieval intellectual history. The pages are filled with your careful Gothic script, each letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that every stroke of the pen was preserving irreplaceable wisdom. Looking back over the completed work, you're struck by the sheer audacity of what Aquinas attempted. He didn't just write another commentary on Scripture or another collection of sermons. He constructed a complete systematic theology that explains everything: God's nature, the creation of the world, the fall of angels, the psychology of human beings, the foundations of moral law, the mechanics of virtue and vice, the sacraments of the Church, and the ultimate destiny of rational creatures. The first part of the Summa analyzes God's existence and attributes with philosophical rigor that rivals any purely philosophical work. The 5 ways for proving God's existence, the discussions of divine simplicity and infinity, the analyses of divine knowledge and will, these represent some of the most sophisticated metaphysical reasoning ever developed. You copied every argument while understanding perhaps one premise in 20. The famous 5 ways alone represent centuries of philosophical development compressed into logically rigorous demonstrations. The first way from motion required understanding Aristotelian concepts of potency, an act that took you weeks to copy without comprehending. The second way from efficient causation involved distinctions between essentially ordered and accidentally ordered causal series that you reproduced with mechanical precision while possessing minimal understanding of their metaphysical significance. The third way from contingency and necessity pushed your comprehension beyond its breaking point with discussions of different types of necessity, various forms of contingency, and modal logical relationships that wouldn't be fully formalized for centuries. The fourth way from degrees of perfection introduced Platonic participation theory that required understanding how finite perfections participate in infinite perfection, concepts you copied without grasping their implications. The fifth way from governance assumed understanding of Aristotelian final causation, teleological order in natural processes, and the relationship between intelligence and purpose that represented sophisticated philosophical analysis you preserved without evaluating. Each demonstration concluded with ad hoc decimus diem, and this we call God, but you copied these conclusions while possessing roughly the theological sophistication necessary to understand that they were supposed to prove something important about divine existence. The analyses of divine attributes that followed the 5 ways introduced concepts that pushed human language to its breaking point. Divine simplicity, the doctrine that God has no composition whatsoever, required understanding how all divine attributes are really identical with each other and with divine essence itself. You copied discussions of how divine goodness, truth, beauty, justice, mercy, and knowledge are not distinct properties in God, but different ways of understanding the single reality of divine perfection. Divine infinity involved metaphysical analysis of unlimited being that transcended categories applicable to finite substances. Divine eternity required grasping the distinction between temporal succession and eternal simultaneity, how God's existence encompasses all temporal moments without being contained by any of them. Divine immutability demanded understanding how unchanging perfection can be the source of changing creation without being affected by temporal development. You copied Aquinas' careful analysis of how divine transcendence is compatible with divine immanence, how God can be entirely beyond creation while being intimately present in all created things. The technical vocabulary of esse per essentiam versus esse per participationem, actus purus versus potentia passiva, simplicitas absoluta versus compositio relativa represented concepts that required philosophical sophistication you didn't possess. The second part of the Summa examines human psychology and moral philosophy with systematic thoroughness that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Aquinas discusses the nature of human happiness, analyzing how rational creatures are oriented toward perfect beatitude that can only be satisfied by direct vision of divine essence. He explores the structure of human action, showing how moral behavior involves the coordination of intellect, will, and appetite in pursuit of rationally apprehended good. You copied hundreds of pages analyzing the psychology of virtue and vice, how repeated good actions create stable dispositions toward excellence, while repeated bad actions create stable dispositions toward moral failure. The cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, were analyzed with Aristotelian precision that showed how natural human capacities can be perfected through rational discipline and good habituation. The theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, were examined as supernatural perfections that elevate human capacities beyond their natural lig. Faith provides certain knowledge of truths that exceed natural reason. Hope directs the will towards supernatural beatitude. Charity enables the soul to love God above all things and neighbor as oneself. These virtues are infused by divine grace rather than acquired through human effort, but they perfect rather than replace natural human capacities. The varieties of law discussed in the second part created a comprehensive framework for understanding moral obligation. Eternal law is God's providence directing all things toward their proper ends. Natural law is rational creatures' participation in eternal law through their capacity to understand moral principles and direct their actions accordingly. Human law applies natural law principles to particular circumstances and communities. Divine law provides supernatural guidance that exceeds natural human capacity. You copied Aquinas' analysis of how these different types of law relate to each other hierarchically. Human laws derive their authority from natural law principles. Natural law participates in eternal law through rational apprehension of divine providence. Divine law supplements natural law with supernatural guidance necessary for achieving perfect beatitude. Each type of law serves specific functions in directing rational creatures toward their ultimate end. The workings of grace were analyzed with theological sophistication that addressed the most complex questions in Christian soteriology. How does divine grace relate to human freedom? How can God cause human good actions without destroying human responsibility? How do supernatural virtues perfect natural capacities without replacing them? How does divine providence direct human choices without necessitating them? Aquinas' answers involve distinctions between different types of grace, various forms of divine causation, and multiple modes of cooperation between divine action and human action. Prevenient grace prepares the soul for conversion. Operative grace produces good actions. Cooperative grace assists human efforts toward perfection. Sufficient grace provides everything necessary for salvation. Efficacious grace actually produces the effects for which it's given. The third part treats the incarnation, the sacraments, and the resurrection with theological sophistication that addresses the most complex questions in Christian doctrine. How can divine and human natures be united in one person without either being diminished or confused? How can physical elements convey spiritual grace? How can mortal bodies be restored to immortal existence? The analysis of the incarnation required understanding hypostatic union, how two complete natures, divine and human, can exist in one divine person without either nature being changed or compromised. You copied discussions of how Christ's human nature possesses genuine human intellect and will that are distinct from but perfectly aligned with divine intellect and will. The technical vocabulary of persona, natura, substantia, hypostasis, and suppositum represented centuries of theological development that clarified how divine and human can be united without confusion. The sacramental theology involved analysis of how physical actions and material elements can be instruments of supernatural grace. Aquinas explained how sacraments work ex opere operato by the action performed, rather than depending solely on the faith or virtue of the minister or recipient. The sacraments cause grace by signifying it, operating as instrumental causes that convey divine effects through material means. You copied detailed analysis of each sacrament. Baptism affects spiritual rebirth, confirmation strengthens supernatural life, Eucharist provides spiritual nourishment, penance restores supernatural life after mortal sin, extreme unction prepares the soul for death, Holy Orders empowers ministers for sacramental functions, and matrimony sanctifies the union between husband and wife. Each analysis required understanding how supernatural effects can be produced through natural means, how divine causation can operate through created instruments. The eschatological discussions that conclude the Summa address questions about human destiny that exceed natural human capacity, but can be illuminated through rational analysis guided by divine revelation. You copied arguments about the separation of soul from body at death, the intermediate state between death and resurrection, the general judgment, and the final restoration of all things. The analysis of bodily resurrection involved complex questions about personal identity, material continuity, and the relationship between natural and supernatural existence. Will resurrected bodies possess the same matter they had during earthly life? Will they retain physical characteristics like age, gender, and distinctive features? Will they experience sensory pleasure and pain? Will they need food, sleep, and other forms of material sustenance? Aquinas' answers demonstrated how resurrection represents both continuity and transformation. Resurrected bodies will be the same persons who lived earthly lives, but they'll possess supernatural properties that transcend natural limitations. They'll be incorruptible, impassible, agile, and subtle, free from decay, suffering, spatial limitation, and material resistance. Yet they'll remain genuine bodies, not purely spiritual substances. Throughout the entire work, his method remains consistent. State the question clearly, present the strongest objections, cite relevant authorities, provide a reasoned response that addresses the heart of the issue, then reply to each objection individually. This scholastic method, which seemed so mechanical when you first encountered it, gradually revealed itself as a sophisticated tool for exploring the most complex questions human beings can ask. But what strikes you most forcefully now is the integration. Aquinas didn't just collect various theological topics and arrange them systematically. He created a unified vision of reality in which everything, God, angels, human beings, natural processes, moral actions, political institutions, sacramental practices, finds its proper place within a comprehensive understanding of existence itself. Divine simplicity explains how God can be the source of created diversity. Divine knowledge accounts for the intelligibility of natural processes. Divine will provides the foundation for moral obligation. Divine providence offers the framework for understanding historical development. Divine justice and mercy explain the distribution of temporal goods and eternal destinies. Every piece fits together with architectural precision. You copied discussions of how prime matter receives substantial forms, how intellectual souls relate to material bodies, how free will operates within divine providence, how natural law participates in eternal law, how supernatural virtues, perfect natural virtues, how sacramental grace operates through physical elements. Each analysis assumes and builds upon previous arguments in ways that create a systematic understanding of reality from its divine source to its ultimate destiny. The philosophical sophistication is breathtaking. Aquinas engages with Aristotle as an intellectual equal, correcting some of his arguments, supplementing others, showing how Aristotelian principles can be extended beyond their original applications. He incorporates insights from Augustine, while avoiding the Platonic tendencies that created tensions in earlier Christian theology. He draws upon Islamic philosophers like Averroes and Avicenna while maintaining distinctively Christian perspectives on creation, providence, and human destiny. The theological orthodoxy is equally impressive. Aquinas addresses the most controversial questions in medieval theology: predestination, the relationship between faith and reason, the nature of sacramental causation, the mechanics of the resurrection, while maintaining careful fidelity to scriptural revelation and church teaching. He shows how rational analysis can illuminate revealed truth without replacing or contradicting it. But perhaps most remarkably, he creates a synthesis that speaks to both contemplative and active religious life. The Summa provides intellectual satisfaction for minds that seek rational understanding of divine truth, but it also offers practical guidance for souls seeking moral perfection and spiritual union with God. Contemplation and action, understanding and love, rational analysis and mystical experience are integrated within a comprehensive vision of human fulfillment. As you reflect on what you've copied, you begin to understand why this particular assignment was considered both an honor and a trial. The Summa Theologica represents the pinnacle of medieval intellectual achievement, a work that won't be surpassed for sophistication, comprehensiveness, or influence. But it also represents something more, a demonstration that human reason, properly guided, can achieve genuine insight into divine truth. Aquinas didn't argue that reason alone can discover everything important about God. He insisted that revelation provides knowledge that exceeds natural human capacity. But he also demonstrated that reason can establish firm foundations for religious belief, can illuminate the content of revealed truth, and can show how faith and understanding work together in the pursuit of wisdom. This synthesis of faith and reason would influence Catholic theology for centuries. Universities across Europe would adopt Aquinas' systematic approach. His arguments would be studied, debated, refined, and extended by generations of scholars. His integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine would become the intellectual foundation for scholastic theology. But all of this future influence depended on the preservation and transmission of his writings, and that preservation was accomplished not by scholars who fully understood his arguments, but by scribes like you who faithfully reproduced his words while possessing minimal comprehension of their significance. The greatest philosophical theology ever written was transmitted to future generations through the humble service of monks who recognized that some tasks exceed individual understanding but still demand faithful completion. The physical manuscripts you produced will survive for centuries. Scholars in Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Cologne and Bologna will study your careful copies. Some of these scholars will achieve genuine understanding of Aquinas' arguments and will extend his insights in creative directions. Others will misunderstand his positions and will develop alternative approaches that clarify his distinctive contributions through contrast. Still others will translate his works into vernacular languages, making his insights accessible to educated readers who lack facility with Latin. But none of this intellectual development would be possible without the foundational work of preservation accomplished by copyists who faithfully transmitted arguments they couldn't fully evaluate. The greatest systematic theology in Christian history was preserved not through intellectual comprehension, but through intellectual humility, the recognition that some truths are too important to lose even when they exceed individual capacity for understanding. Your 18 months in the scriptorium represent a particular form of intellectual virtue, the willingness to serve truth that exceeds your ability to grasp it completely. You didn't understand Aquinas' proofs for God's existence, but you preserved them accurately for minds better prepared to evaluate their logical structure. You couldn't follow his analyses of divine attributes, but you transmitted them faithfully for theologians capable of appreciating their systematic coherence. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of your copying experience. Intellectual humility is not the opposite of intellectual achievement, but rather its necessary foundation. The greatest philosophical and theological insights are preserved and transmitted not by minds that fully comprehend them, but by minds that recognize their importance despite their own limitations. Aquinas himself exemplified this intellectual humility. Despite his extraordinary philosophical gifts, he insisted that human reason has definite limits, and that the most important truths about God and human destiny must be received through revelation rather than discovered through natural investigation. His systematic theology demonstrates both the power and the limitations of human rational capacity. The Summa shows what human reason can achieve when properly guided: rigorous analysis of fundamental questions, systematic integration of diverse insights, careful evaluation of competing arguments, and precise articulation of complex distinctions. But it also shows what reason cannot achieve independently: certain knowledge of divine mysteries, understanding of supernatural destiny, and practical wisdom for navigating the complexities of moral and spiritual life. This balance between intellectual confidence and intellectual humility characterizes not just Aquinas' approach to theology, but also your approach to preserving his insights. You copied his arguments with confidence that they represent genuine intellectual achievements worthy of preservation, but you also copied them with humility about your own capacity to evaluate their truth or significance fully. As Brother Marcus carefully wraps the completed manuscript for transport to Cluny, you reflect on the strange privilege of your assignment. You've spent 18 months in intimate contact with some of the most profound philosophical and theological insights ever developed. You've copied arguments that won't be surpassed for logical rigor, discussions that won't be matched for systematic comprehensiveness, and synthesis that won't be equal for intellectual integration. But your relationship to these insights has been necessarily indirect. You've preserved them without fully understanding them, transmitted them without completely evaluating them, and served them without entirely comprehending their significance. In a sense, you've been like a medieval librarian, responsible for maintaining intellectual treasures, whose full value you can appreciate only partially. Yet perhaps this indirect relationship is precisely what was required. Perhaps Aquinas' insights could only be preserved by minds that were more concerned with faithful transmission than with intellectual innovation. Perhaps the systematic theology that would influence centuries of scholarship could only be maintained by scribes who prioritized accuracy over creativity, fidelity over originality, service over self-expression. The monastery bells ring for Vespers, marking the end of another day and the completion of your extraordinary assignment. Tomorrow you'll return to more ordinary copying tasks, biblical commentaries, liturgical texts, administrative documents. Your hands will continue to move across parchment, your eyes will continue to strain over medieval handwriting, and your back will continue to ache from hours of careful transcription. But you'll carry with you the knowledge that you've participated in something historically significant. You've helped preserve the intellectual foundation for centuries of theological scholarship. You've ensured that Aquinas' synthesis of faith and reason will be available to future generations of scholars, students, and spiritual seekers. You've contributed to the transmission of wisdom that exceeds your individual capacity to understand completely. In the grand scheme of intellectual history, your role may seem humble. You didn't develop original philosophical arguments, create innovative theological syntheses, or resolve complex scholarly debates. You simply copied what others had written, preserved what others had created, and transmitted what others had achieved. But without this humble service of preservation and transmission, the greatest intellectual achievements would be lost to subsequent generations. The most profound philosophical insights would disappear with their creators. The most sophisticated theological arguments would remain confined to single manuscripts in monastery libraries. Intellectual progress depends not just on original creativity, but also on faithful preservation of creative achievements. Your 18 months of copying represent a particular form of intellectual service that rarely receives recognition but remains absolutely essential, the preservation of wisdom for minds not yet prepared to receive it, the transmission of insights across generations separated by centuries, and the humble recognition that some truths are too important to lose, even when they exceed individual comprehension. As you close the scriptorium for the final time as copyist of the Summa Theologica, you carry with you both exhaustion and satisfaction. Your body bears the physical marks of your intellectual service, curved spine, cramped fingers, strained eyes, but your spirit carries the deeper satisfaction of having participated in something greater than individual understanding, the preservation and transmission of wisdom that will continue to illuminate minds and nourish souls long after your own temporal existence has ended. This is how medieval monasteries preserved the greatest philosophical achievements of their age, not through perfect comprehension, but through perfect fidelity, not through complete understanding, but through complete dedication to the service of truth that exceeds individual capacity but demands collective preservation. The Summa Theologica will endure. Your careful copy will contribute to its survival and influence. And somewhere in the future, scholars with better philosophical preparation will read your transcription and achieve understanding that was beyond your reach. This is perhaps the greatest accomplishment available to finite minds, the preservation of infinite wisdom through humble recognition of intellectual limitation combined with faithful commitment to truth that exceeds individual comprehension.